In the last exciting episode of Handhelds Around the World on this channel, we looked at the Game Boy Color. Looking back at history, Nintendo have consistently dominated the portable market, and no one has ever even come close to beating them. Despite this fact, as mentioned in the previous episode, the Game Boy Color itself felt extremely dated upon release, and with its 8-bit graphics, it didn't really feel like it should have even been on the market in the noughties. The competition, on the other hand, had much more aesthetically pleasing options available. The Bandai WonderSwan and the Neo Geo Pocket Color. They were both powerhouses in comparison. Both systems offered 16-bit graphics, and unlike colour portables of old, such as the Sega Game Gear and the Atari Lynx, these systems actually had respectable battery lives too. So to counter these two promising handhelds, Nintendo decided to cut the Game Boy Color's life short, after just a mere 2 years on the market. The Game Boy Advance is a whopping 32-bit handheld video games console, developed and manufactured by Nintendo as the successor to the Game Boy Color. It was first released in Japan on March 21st, 2001, and at that point in history it was the most powerful handheld gaming device that had ever existed. In contrast to the previous Game Boy models, which were all following the portrait form factor of the original Game Boy, the Game Boy Advance was designed in a landscape form factor, putting the buttons to the side of the device instead of below the screen. The Game Boy Advance was designed by the French designer Guenale Nicolas and his Tokyo-based design studio Curiosity Inc. It is also of note that the original Game Boy designer Gunpei Yokoi had also designed the Bandai WonderSwan to be played in landscape, just 1 year prior. For me personally, the Game Boy Advance was probably the most exciting handheld release of my life. It was amazing to finally see a Nintendo handheld that featured more than simple 8-bit graphics. However, even more importantly than that, the hardware was comparable to the Super Nintendo, so I was finally going to get decent looking 2D games on a regular basis for the first time in many years. For me, as a gamer, the world of living room consoles was rather uninspiring at the time, with systems heavily focusing on ugly blocky polygon games, rather than offering up any crisp refined 2D games like the Game Boy Advance would go on to offer. The Game Boy Advance represented progress for sprite-based technology. The system went on to feature many platformers, SNES-style role-playing games, and multiple classic games ported from various 8-bit and 16-bit systems of the previous generations. This obviously included the Super Mario Advance series, Final Fantasy IV, 5 and 6, amongst many others. Another disgustingly cool feature of the Game Boy Advance was that the system is double backwards compatible. Not only can the system play all the recently released Game Boy Color games, but it can even play all the original Game Boy software too. Ah, those were the days when corporations used to actually let you continue to play your old games, rather than always simply trying to coax you into purchasing the same titles over and over again. The GBA's full-colour TFT LCD screen was undoubtedly one of the system's greatest features. The display generated gorgeous blur-free visuals that were a sight to behold. The only issue though was that the display relied solely on external light sources, which meant that it either had to be played in direct sunlight or beneath some kind of artificial illumination. This problem, like with the Game Boy Color before it, made me yearn for the beautiful backlight of the Sega Game Gear. A backlight at the time was the only feature missing from the GBA, which I had strongly wished they had have included. But I just made the assumption that it would have eaten batteries, like with all systems that had included them previously. I only had to wait 2 more years though to see this problem rectified, when Nintendo released a revised model of the system named the Game Boy Advance SP. The GBA SP featured a flip screen, which I gather drew inspiration in design from the Game & Watch devices of the past, along with the flip screen mobile phones of the present. The SP was even more portable than its predecessor, and the fold down design helped protect the screen when the machine wasn't in use. More importantly than that though, the system featured a front-lit display which finally made it possible to play games in a light dimmer than that was generated by the bloody sun. My fear about the lighting system eating batteries was also quickly vanquished, since the system also featured a built-in rechargeable battery. This felt revolutionary at the time, since it removed the problem of constantly leaving the house in order to stock up on bloody Durexes. In regard to the GBA SP though, there was one function removed from the device from the previous model. In order to save the internal space, Nintendo had to remove the headphone jack from the system, which forced users to purchase a separate attachment that plugged into the charging socket of the console. Not only did this create an extra cost, it also meant that users couldn't listen using headphones and charge the console at the same time. Personally, I've only just learnt about this functionality upon producing this video. I had no idea that there was a way to use headphones with the device full stop. Despite the lack of a conventional headphone jack, the GBA SP with its backlight, flip screen, rechargeable battery and ability to play Game Boy, Game Boy Color and Game Boy Advance games altogether made this by far the most impressive handheld gaming device I'd ever seen. 2003 was a fantastic year for me in general, and the Game Boy Advance SP made that time period even sweeter. But before we get to 2003, let's go back to the Game Boy Advance's launch year of 2001. I was 15 years old at the time and was bought one as a gift at launch, just a few weeks before I went on holiday to Greece for the whole summer. I can recall visiting Dixon's at Gatwick Airport at the beginning of this trip and being thoroughly spoilt with new games to take with me. I think I can recall getting bought loads, including Mario Advance, Kuro Kuru Kururin and Ready to Rumble Boxing. One title I got that day that stuck out to me more than any other was Rayman Advance. It simply blew my mind to see this game ported to a handheld, as the game looked so beautiful. I remember appreciating the title so much when I experienced it on the PS1. It was such a pleasure to play an artistic 2D side-scroller. The game impressed me so much it even brought me to the sad realisation that we were missing out on what that generation could have done with 2D gaming. Instead, going forward, I had to try and accept that we were mostly only going to see ugly polygon games going forward during that generation. Whilst it was clear that console gaming would be buried under an ugly polygon mess for many years to come, the GBA looked like it would bring the return of decent looking games to the table. Good looking 2D games may have been absent from the living room, but Rayman Advance signalled a beacon of hope for me that the situation would not be replicated in the world of handhelds. And now retrospectively looking back on this anecdote, my assumptions were pretty much bang on, as the Game Boy Advance has probably one of the best 2D libraries of games we have ever seen. It wasn't all sunshine and rainbows for me with the Game Boy Advance though. There were a few occasions where I wished I was given something a little bit different. On the whole, for example, the Mario Advance series was pretty lackluster. I was desperate for a new 2D Mario game, and all Nintendo would bloody give me was poxy re-releases. They were not even impressive revisions of the games either. Nintendo pretty much set a precedence with Super Mario Bros. Deluxe on the Game Boy Color, which included absolutely bloody tons and tons of new features. The Mario Advance games though featured less and less additional content with each iteration. The difference in Mario World and Yoshi's Island, for example, featured so few changes that they may as well have just been bloody ports. There was nothing advanced about them, so overall no new Mario games on the Game Boy Advance made me a little bit sad. The other big franchise disappointment for me was Pokemon Ruby and Sapphire. You have to remember the Game Boy Advance was a 32-bit system, so I was expecting a massive jump in terms of graphics and mechanics in the series. Ruby and Sapphire, on the other hand, looked very slapdash compared to what they could have pulled off on the hardware. To further my disdain for these entries in the Pokemon series was the fact that you couldn't even catch them all. Nintendo had previously drummed into us that was the main point of Pokemon, and it was to embark on this OCD collect 'em up. But suddenly, 136 Pokemon from previous entries were missing in action. Like, what sort of Pokemon game even is it? You cannot even obtain Bulbasaur, Charmander and Squirtle. The whole thing was sacrilegious. And to top it off, there was bloody water everywhere. From previous experiences, any levels or temples within games that contain a lot of water usually end up being on the irritating or lackluster side of things. When I heard they were re-releasing Ruby and Sapphire on the 3DS, I was disgusted, as I have always considered them the most half-arsed entries within the main Pokemon series. I find it really strange that people seem to love these games so much. Overall, the Mario Advance titles and Ruby and Sapphire are all welcome additions to the GBA's library. I was just hoping for more inspired stuff over the time period, especially when you consider what a 2D powerhouse the GBA actually was. Mario Kart Super Circuit, on the other hand, was a game I was impressed with. There is a huge step up in quality between Super Mario Kart on the Super Nintendo and Super Circuit on the GBA. I just wish they could have done the same with the Mario side-scrollers instead of just porting old games. I wonder why they made a new Mario Kart game instead of simply porting the old one. Either way, it was a move I was very appreciative of. Super Circuit remains one of my favourite Mario Kart games, as the game offered so much more content than previous entries in the series. The game featured, I believe, 40 different racetracks, as opposed to the 16 we had in Mario Kart 64, a quality effort from Nintendo. The Game Boy Advance was also the first Nintendo handheld to feature a plethora of decent Sega games. The Dreamcast had recently been discontinued and Sega had exited the console market. However, every cloud has a silver lining, and we have sporadically got decent third-party Sega games right up until this very day. Unlike Mario Advance, which was simply a series of porty slapdash remakes, the Sonic Advance series on the other hand were all new 2D Sonic side-scrollers. This may be a controversial opinion, but I think the 3 games are even better than the classic Sonic series on the Mega Drive. However, I am not going into why right now, as that could possibly be a whole nother video in its own right. Yeah. Whilst Pokemon had wowed me with its addictive nature in the previous handheld generations, the game of the GBA era that probably sucked me in the most was WarioWare Inc. I have made a whole standalone video on this channel about how much I loved the game, but to quickly summarise, the game was so fresh, innovative and pick up and play that it consumed hundreds of hours of playtime for myself. I'd never played anything like it at the time. Pity I learned years later that it was simply a bit of a rip-off of the Japan exclusive Tantar game on the Mega Drive, which I have also made a video about. As mentioned previously, I owned the Game Boy Advance, then upgraded 2 years later to the GBA SP. However, there was a third and final redesign of the GBA which I happened to miss out on at the time. 2005 saw the last ever release in the Game Boy line, the Game Boy Micro. This is easily the worst model in the GBA series, as unlike its predecessors, the Game Boy Micro lacks backwards compatibility for both the Game Boy and the Game Boy Color games. Also, the bloody device is offensively small and hard to play if you're a man. What is this? A console for ants? I'll just have to make the politically incorrect assumption that Asians' hands must be smaller, as the Famicom Mini's controllers are so small that they are pretty much unusable too. A cool factoid regarding the Game Boy Micro though is that there is a Japan exclusive mother-free edition, which I wouldn't mind adding to my collection someday. Who knows, maybe I'll give the device a second chance and review it in this channel in full one day. So, apart from the 3 models of GBA, there was also a 4th official way which consumers could play their cartridges, and that was through the Gameboy Player, which connected into the bottom of the GameCube. This fully backwards compatible device could display Game Boy, Game Boy Color and Game Boy Advance games all wonderfully on the big screen. Playing Game Boy Advance games back home on a CRT television has always been a pleasurable experience, not that far removed from playing games on an actual Super Nintendo. A fantastic little device. Also, I would like to add that it is very irritating indeed that Nintendo have refused to release peripherals that let us play our DS and 3DS libraries on the Switch and the Wii U. The dual screen setup would have been bloody perfect on the Wii U. In regards once again to the games themselves, the GBA has a deep library of 1081 games. However, I advise you not to quote me on this, as this piece of information may or may not be a trap I've had to put in place in order to protect me from scum like Watch Mojo stealing my content. Out of all of those games, like with any system, we received our fair share of shovelware and low quality ports from other systems. But between all of this there is a large quantity of great games, including various hidden gems and multiple releases featuring top IPs. I've obviously talked about some of the notable releases in this video, and I could literally go on all day about the depth of the quality this system has. Fire Emblem games, Link to the Past, Minish Cap, Metroid Fusion, the Mega Man Zero series, Mother 3, Pokemon Fire Red and Leaf Green. It would take a long time to get bored of the Game Boy Advance. So now, as a traditional staple of this show, I am going to talk about some of my favourite GBA games in even more detail. Yeah! I mentioned earlier in the video that the death of the Dreamcast led to the arrival of Sega publishing games on the GBA. Fan favourite developer Treasure released the long-awaited follow-up to Gunstar Heroes on the platform. Gunstar Future Heroes, known as Gunstar Super Heroes in North America, takes place following the events of the previous game on the Mega Drive. The game also features an expanded combat system over its predecessor. If you enjoy Gunstar Heroes on the Mega Drive, you'll love this side-scrolling shooter too. Just like the original game, this one didn't sell too well either, despite even receiving several Best GBA Games of E3 2005 awards. Amazingly though, unlike the Mega Drive game, this version remains extremely cheap, so you can pick up a physical copy on eBay whenever you feel like it. Treasure also brought the sequel to another game from their back catalogue to the platform. Advanced Guardian Heroes is the follow-up to Guardian Heroes on the Sega Bloody Saturn. Guardian Heroes has sadly been one of those titles that has eluded me over the years, and I keep intending to purchase a copy. Despite never actually playing the original, I still got a good kick out of Advanced Guardian Heroes though. Advanced Guardian Heroes is a side-scrolling beat-em-up in which the playable characters can perform physical and magical attacks. The game remains very cheap and is an easy pick up and play today. Unlike Gunstar Future Heroes, this one received mixed reviews on release. That didn't stop me having a great time with this game though. Why not give it a try so that you can make your own mind up regarding this one? WarioWare Twisted was the sequel to WarioWare Inc. and was one of the later games released on the GBA. The game plays much in the same way as the original, and it's stacked to the brim with 3-second micro games. This time, however, completely new control mechanics are introduced to the game, and the game's cartridge features built-in motion control, which was somewhat of a blueprint for the Nintendo's Wiimotes. If you take the success of the Wii into account, you could make a case for WarioWare Twisted being one of the most important Nintendo games in the company's entire history. Innovations aside, this is a fun game and amongst the very best on the entire platform. There are two great Advance Wars games on the GBA, and I have finished both of them. Advance Wars were the first entries in the West in a series that had been established back in Japan all the way back in the Famicom days. The first game I played in the series was Advance Wars 2 Black Hole Rising, which I believe is the better of the two games on the system anyway. This tactical role-playing game with a war theme kind of reminded me of an innovative version of chess when I first discovered it. However, I later learned that there were many tactical role-playing games that played much in the same way. Still though, I think the Advance Wars games over the period far outclassed their Fire Emblem contemporaries. This confuses me to this day, that Advance Wars games eventually stopped being made, yet the Fire Emblem games continue. Maybe the Japanese audience is different, because I have yet to meet a Westerner who prefers Fire Emblem over Advance Wars. Just imagine Advance Wars games today, with the same level of detail that they put into the Fire Emblem Fates games. It's so sad more support was given to the more cringy waifu series. So, as you would have been able to tell by watching this video, I haven't been able to shut up about all the great games on the GBA. I think it speaks volumes about a system if that in one of my videos I felt the need to dedicate so much time to purely speaking about the games. The Game Boy Advance is everything a console should be, a simple, no gimmicks, no nonsense, pure gaming device. And for that reason, I think it probably surpassed the Game Boy's earlier incarnations in every single way. The GBA offers such a bright, colourful, fun gaming experience that to some degree felt like we were enjoying the golden age of Super Nintendo and Sega Mega Drive gaming all over again. So is the Game Boy Advance worth playing today? Well, obviously yes, and probably more so than any other handheld I have covered on this channel to date. The system is just that bloody good. As a handheld, it's genuinely hard to pick holes in it. Thank you for watching today's video. Shout outs to Shiguka Kabayashi, Retail Archaeology, Andrew Bazansky, Peter Dawn, Mike Frost, Edward O'Reilly, Antinas Garcia, and all of my other patrons. Thank you for all of your support so much. And to all of you out there, don't forget to like, comment, share, all the usual things you do with social media. And let me know in the comment section what you think of the Game Boy Advance. Also, if you want to be added to my list of patrons and want to support this channel even further, then go check out my Patreon page. There's some pretty cool rewards too. Ta-ta and farewell.